Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by, I've lost count, I think 4-time returning guest, Noah Rettberg. Definitely someone who is frequently in the top 5, although you jostle in position with Doomberg, Mark Nelson, Caleb Calumetz, some of the other Decouple favorites. Noah and I talk a lot kind of offline, and we have these fabulous conversations. I'm always kicking myself for not recording them. So today, we're going to be doing a little bit of a smorgasbord, something probably a little more casual. I hope it's going to be entertaining for the listeners. But as a quick reminder, beyond that glowing introduction, Noah is a physics laboratory technician in training and a member of the German pro-nuclear movement called Nuclearia. Previous episodes, definitely worth checking out. The Grim Fairy Tale of German Electricity was your first appearance. And I'm trying to remember the other titles, but you've given us some great updates.
I think it was Canary in a Coal Mine and How to Fail in Energy Transition.
Those are the exact titles. Anyway, Noah, it's awesome seeing you again. Welcome back to Decouple.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me here and allowing me to punch way above my weight. Being in the top Decouple episodes with like actually accomplished people like Caliph and Mark and Doomberg.
Well, Decouple is a meritocracy, and you've earned your position. I'll just put it that way. The guests, sorry, not the guests. The listeners have decided, Noah. So you're just going to have to, it's good. Stay humble, but you deserve it. Anyway, let's just catch up a little bit. I don't think you need to do the self-introduction because you're such a Decouple veteran, but what's new? What's exciting? What are you thinking about these days, Noah?
Specifically, the last days we have had a severe Dunkelflaute in Germany and in all over Europe. I mean, those are not countrywide phenomena. Those are continent-wide phenomena. And we are experiencing basically a doldrum at the same time of having almost no sun out all over the continent, with some exceptions like in Denmark and the most western parts of Britain. But basically, this is a continent-wide phenomenon. No amount of interconnectors will phase it, and it's enduring now for 3 days, and we're burning gluttonous amounts of coal right now. I mean, we're seeing amounts of coal and gas online on the German grid that basically a year ago I would not have thought they would be technically able to get on the grid. Right? We have now 31 gigawatts and 17 of coal, 17 gigawatts of gas. Like hats off to Mr. Habeck. I was actually skeptical that he could bring enough coal and gas online to replace those 3 giant reactors, but apparently he did.
And that is okay. Like, there's been a few headlines that have flashed past, and I haven't like fact checked them all. But have you guys already brought those 5 semi-retired lignite plants back online? Is that part of what's contributed to the amazing success of keeping the German grid alive?
So when we talk about semi-retired lignite plants, we have brought, I think, several smaller units back. I think when we did our last episode, they have already brought 3 plants back. Excuse me, no, not 3 plants, 3 units back, but those were smaller units. We have also brought back other plants, like we have brought bituminous coal plants back, like the Hayden coal power plants, which is effectively replacing the Gronde nuclear power plant. We have also brought back 800 gigawatt coal unit in the south of my state. The name currently escapes me. And yeah, we have brought several coal power plants back online and did a similar thing with gas.
And like, how visible are they? Like when they fire back up? Because I mean, I know from friends that did a bicycle trip across Germany, they were just like, there are fucking wind turbines everywhere. Like that amount of the energy infrastructure is like very visible. I'm just wondering, like I've seen footage of the Mordor lignite pits, and Jesse Freeston did a good little tour with Thiesbeckers in that region. But for instance, that coal plant that fired back up in the south of your state, is that something like that a German would be aware of? Is it just because we're paying attention to electricity map and seeing that Germany is the same color as fucking Poland right now in terms of carbon emissions on electricity map? Or like, how visible is it to the German public? How aware is the German public of the fact that they're just cruising on like majority coal now?
I mean, you will read it in some outlets, but if you don't read it, you will not see it. It's not visible to you if you don't either follow the data or or the outlets that you trust in will write about it. But it's just another tower blowing some steam in the air. You will see that also from many industrial side when you drive along highways. So that is not an uncommon sight in those troll power plants, while they are more massive. I mean, not more massive, but more voluminous than nuclear power plants. They are larger in that regard. It's like usually 1 or 2 units of them, and not thousands of them like you have with wind power plants. So most people will not notice this. Probably
Is there air
with
quality issues? Like, do people notice like the air is worse, or like are they far enough away from urban centers that you don't really notice? The other thing I've heard from hold on, the other thing I've heard from activists in Ontario, anti-nuclear activists in Ontario, is who point to Germany as the example as recently as last year at a Fridays for Future climate march. They said, Germany has shut their old coal plants, and the ones they have online are state of the art. They're really good for the air. They've got great particulate capture systems. I mean, you guys do things well. You're a good nation of engineers.
So I would to a degree subscribe to that. Those German power plants, this is not an anti-coke, which has barely any air filtering system. Those coal power plants that we have there are pretty much dead. Already in the 60s, when air quality as a matter of fossil fuel burning became such a big issue that it couldn't be no longer ignored. We implemented ever more increasing regulations on them. And the way that this works with coal and also with nuclear is basically that what the German regulations say is your plant has to be state of the art. So this is basically the technological requirement that all those German nuclear power plants get. And this is also the reason why all those German nuclear power plants got so many upgrades over their lifetime, while basically all the American ones got stagnant. The American nuclear regulator said, don't touch anything, keep everything as it is, because it is kind of safe the way it is, and we don't trust new stuff, and new stuff has to go to a rigorous process. The German regulators endorsed the nuclear operators to implement newer and safer technology in their plant, and sometimes even forced them to and shut down plants when they didn't. And a similar thing is true, although they are less rigid there with the fossil fuel plants. So those coal power plants going back online and burning a crap ton of coal does not affect German air quality to the degree that, for example, an anti-coke being online would affect Toronto air quality. But they will still negatively impact German air quality, and we will see probably thousands of, maybe tens of thousands of more people getting sick from this, and probably hundreds of people dying from the additional air pollution from the coal power plants. So this will be definitely the fact, but it will not be as severe as it was in Toronto.
Right. I want to just get a little bit more of an update on the kind of current situation in Germany. You are kind of our official German correspondent. We're going to be getting to, I think, a more theoretical discussion of something that we're both passionate about, which is the human factors element of energy transition. So, just to give our listeners a sense of what's coming up. But just, I guess, a couple more anecdotes. I mean, it's funny how we get our information and how it's filtered. Our perceptions of the world are so incomplete, especially with social media algorithms kind of feeding us content, further siloing us into our communities. But, some of the stuff that crosses my plate is like a German exercise phenomenon, like dancing to stay warm. I think, again, this is probably skewed by my biases that this comes across my platform. I don't think it's the new exercise craze to hit Germany, but I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of, what is the overall gestalt feeling on the street in terms of the energy crisis? Is it, some people have suggested, and again, my biases might be that it's the human experience of it is worse than it is. But again, from a German on the ground there, what's the overall sense of how the energy crisis is proceeding, and the effects you're feeling kind of in society, be it turning down your thermostats or more factories closing or whatever comes to mind for you?
So different people are feeling this energy crisis differently, depending how materially well off they are, where they live, how they live, what their jobs are. So what we are already seeing is slowly ramping up the industrialization of Germany. which now basically even German state media doesn't say isn't happening anymore. So this is already going on, and it will be going on. And this feeling of this can hurt our economy severely, and in the long run, I think this is very present in the German mind, with maybe some exceptions among very ardent Green supporters. But this feeling of something is going down is present. Regarding to the are people freezing in their home? Certainly, but has always been the case that not everyone was like being able to pay their bills, but this is much more severely this winter now. That we will have more people that are lowering their thermostats in order to save gas, not because they want to, but because they have to, as they can't afford it anymore. But this also varies how well off you are, where do you get your energy from. Many people have like district heating, they don't need to rely on that. Oil has been getting a little bit more cheaper right now. It is still very expensive, but it's not as expensive as it used to be during the peaks of like €2 per liter. So people with oil heating are probably a bit better off in this sense right now. So this is definitely one effect. What is definitely happening right now is we are seeing a lot of people burning a lot more firewood to stay warm, and this is a vector of air pollution that will be increasing, as with many home fireplaces. I mean, we are now seeing them getting air filters, but many don't have them. So unlike those coal power plants, they are unfiltered, and in large cities that can become a problem. Less so in the countryside, but in cities it does. So that's going on.
It's super interesting in Canada. Like, we have the province of Quebec, which is, almost all hydroelectricity. They heat with hydro. They're winter peaking. But there's a kind of romantic attachment in Canada to burning wood. I mean, I used to think it smelled good when I walked down a city block and heard and smelled a wood-fired chimney. As I learned more about air pollution, I started to think otherwise. And an interesting kind of factoid is,
I liked it. I grew up on the countryside.
Yeah.
We had like a wood-fired oven as like an auxiliary heating device. I fucking loved it. Chopping down some old trees in our garden that were too old and would sit, and then having some matzes and chopping it into little pieces of firewood, put it in the oven in the winter, drinking a hot cup of cocoa, and my mother reading Christmas tales to me. So I very much sympathize with this feeling of sympathy that people have for firewood. I can understand it.
It's the equivalent, though, in the city anyway. Well, in the country as well, but I guess the city, you're more jam packed together. Of idling a semi truck, an 18-wheeler, just having it idling out front of your house. Apparently, it's similar kind of in terms of the air quality issues. And what I was saying about Quebec, Montreal, they actually banned the use of home, fireplaces because they were getting smog days in the winter. Despite heating with electricity and having a very, very clean energy system. Anyway, it's an interesting anecdote. Let's shift gears and move on to some of the stuff we've been sort of talking about offline and wanting to get out to the masses. As I said, I talk a lot about the nuclear secret sauce. I'm not going to do it again in depth because my listeners are probably tired of hearing me reference it and are probably well acquainted with it. But in short, it's trying to identify what were the preconditions of the various successful nuclear buildouts that happened over and over again, country to country, like a relay race, passing the baton. And briefly, those were low interest capital, favorable governance with good, stable regulations, a nuclear reactor design that's proven, standardized, and then supply chains and human factors, intimately familiar with nuclear building and with the design that is being built. I've already gone on too long, but the human factors element, I think we both agree, is kind of one of the critical elements of the story that gets least talked about. We're always talking about reactor designs and reactor sizes, should they be small versus large. We're aware of how high interest capital can drive prices up through the roof. But this whole labor element, I think, is a passion for both of us. And particularly when talking about, this potential for a nuclear renaissance and how ambitious we can be, I think both of us would like to see 1,000 reactors bloom. But I think both of us have, spent enough time analyzing this field to understand that as much as we might wish for that, it's just not going to happen on any kind of a short time scale, particularly that would be consistent with some of our climate goals. But human factors, I think, is that something that we kind of agree on as being, Caleb Calumetz was on, and he kind of agreed that has the longest lead time. You can get a reactor pressure vessel a lot faster than you can train up a whole workforce. Are you in agreement that human factors is probably the greatest limiting step, not just to nuclear, but to any energy transition, or do you have an alternative hypothesis?
Yes, I would subscribe to that. There is really nothing, no resource that is really a limiting factor to nuclear, and the only limiting factor that we will struggle to overcome is labor requirements. Nuclear has barely any land requirements, barely any material requirements, like stuff that would actually be consumable in a nuclear reactors, fissile materials, zirconium, all that stuff is plentifully available. So that doesn't limit us in how much nuclear we can build. All that will limit us in the long run is how many people can we get into nuclear, and how much energy will be generated per human working into nuclear.
I think we're in agreement there. I mean, there's people talk about like, uranium reserves are limited. If we did add like 20 to 30 reactors every year, we'd be out of uranium in 70 or 80 years. I know that you're a big fan of sodium fast reactors, and there are ways to breed nuclear fuel and really extend that. I think Nick Turan is on the record as saying we have like 1 billion years of nuclear fuel if we were to close the fuel cycle. So, uranium often comes up as a potential limiter in terms of like the long-term viability of nuclear, but let's keep focused on the human factors and dive into that a little bit more of a granular level.
I want to ask you one question. Why do you think that pressurized water reactors are so dominant in nuclear? Let's exclude the CANDUs, which are also kind of pressurized. But why do you think that pressurized water reactors, for example, were so popular, especially in the US, which was one of the first big movers, basically the first big mover in nuclear?
I mean, the narrative that I'm most familiar with is that Rickover, went for that with the submarine design, the Nautilus, and then because that was kind of the most developed technology by the U.S. Navy, the most mature one, that it just kind of dominated as they moved into power plants. That's the story that I've heard. And there's the thorium bros who say there's a bit more of a conspiracy theory and that it's all tied into nuclear weapons, and that they could have gone the kind of molten salt thorium route, but they didn't because you wouldn't get weapons grade material. Those are the two, maybe the ones I'm most familiar with in terms of theories. But I'm guessing that you have a shocker here for us.
No, it's. I mean, you're kind of going to the right direction. Of course, Rickover's nuclear navy played a big role in that, and this is simply for the reason that in many U.S. nuclear power plants in the U.S., still currently, but even more in the past, the people working there were people that used to work on nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers. The U.S. nuclear navy cranked out a lot of nuclear technicians that worked 10 to 20 years as nuclear technicians on those vessels. And then when they retired, they were still at an age where they could still work for 20 more years. And they then went and did what they were best, running pressurized water reactors. So when we see this period where the U.S. civil nuclear fleet enters its like decline phase in the early 80s, late 70s, manpower issues were their biggest concern. And you clearly say that this U.S. nuclear navy was one of their largest source of manpower, of qualified labor for them, as it kept cranking out skilled nuclear technicians, and fewer of the bright people that wanted to go into nuclear went into nuclear, as other technologies like the early computer age was more attractive to many nerds in the US. So this manpower was a limiting issue for the US. And for light water reactors and pressurized water reactors, you have had a had a source of skilled manpower. Even though it was limited, it was a steady flow and source of manpower.
Yeah. So that's an interesting history regarding that skilled labor force, because one of the narratives that I'm familiar with in terms of nuclear advocacy is that nuclear is such a great thing for the surrounding communities because with little more than a high school education, you can be upskilled. Again, with maybe just a high school degree into becoming a nuclear operator. So that runs contrary to some things I've heard. Can you expand on that a little bit and help me understand a little bit more the composition of that nuclear workforce?
So I'm most familiar with, of course, the German fleet. So what I can give you is more best information of the German fleet. So those enormous 1.4 gigawatt German nuclear reactors, they usually have a workforce of around 300 to 400 people. Depends if it's a single unit or double unit site. Like Remin has a little bit less, Biblis has a little bit less because it has two of the same units on the same site. If you are on a shift in this German nuclear power plant, you have people there that are doing security. You have some maintenance technicians, machinists, electricians, mechatronics that are there doing normal work days, doing some upkeep operations. You have people working basically on standby. So if something breaks, this is very interesting. We had something like this happening at the same time when we had a demonstration at Grunde. One control line broke, and of the 4 redundant control lines, one broke. So if another one would break of those control lines, then the plant had to go offline. So they had it was on a weekend, and they had to call an electrician working during the night and keeping and repairing those control lines until all 4 redundant control lines were working. So you have this the maintenance workforce working during normal work days. You have those standby maintenance workforce, basically that you have just to call it to come. Then you maybe have some maintenance workforce that is always there as part of the shifts. You have 8 guys in the control room. 2 for the cooling towers, 2 for the reactor, 2 for the turbine island, shift supervisor, and vice supervisor. So basically, that shift supervisor is the only person that would really be required to be an academic. He is leading the plant at the plant, and he would need to be like an engineer or a physicist or chemist or something, like a natural academic. All the other people, including the not the shift supervisor, but the second in command, basically, who is doing most of the work, keeping running the plant. Actually, that second in command is far more important, basically, from what I've heard from the people working there, than the first in command. All those are not required really to be academic. So there are a lot of technicians there that have not went to university, but have instead went to trade school, become mechatronics, become electricians, become pipe fitters, plumbers, whatever, and then basically were further educated to be nuclear operators. And this is probably also something that could be open to me when I finish with my training as a physics lab technician, that I could go to Switzerland and further be trained as a nuclear operator. So this is what probably I could do. And so yes, those people many of them were not academics. They are not just people who got a high school degree.
Right.
They definitely got proper professional training and were tested to very high standards. They train on very good simulators for a long time, so those are properly trained people, and they earn a lot of money. When you are on the parking lot of that Grunde nuclear power plant, you will see a lot of very good cars.
I mean, not so much the car side of things, but just the kind of human flourishing element, people reaching their full potential is I think one of the reasons I'm passionate about nuclear. I did a Myers-Briggs personality test a little while ago, and the sort of core theme of my personality type, the thing that gives me the greatest satisfaction is, watching and assisting people blossom into their full potential. And, when I go up to Bruce County, which is, it's had a bit of a fishing past, there's some farming there. But before the nuclear power plant was there wasn't much going on economically. the level of skilled trades and engineering and STEM and academics wasn't very high. And the way in which that nuclear power plant over a generation has just transformed the human potential of that region is something that's I think truly commendable and astonishing. And something I talk about in my kind of just transition testimony is the stark differences that we have between the wind and solar future of slapping together Chinese manufactured solar panels and wind turbines in a way that's delocalized, transient, frankly shitty work, with low paying wages, or something like nuclear. Now, there's often sort of a competing selling point here of, well, there's going to be millions of green energy jobs. This is part of the just transition. There's a lot of public relations and marketing around that, and I think not enough analysis. And I remember reading a Twitter thread of yours recently that was this talking about this very question in terms of the limitations on the kind of quality or just how well paying a job can be with this sort of conventional idea of the wind and solar
there certainly
transition.
are also some well-paying jobs in those renewable sectors. I don't want to deny that, but let me be quite clear. You hear two talking points that are constantly being regurgitated from people trying to sell renewable energy to the public. It is very cheap, and it will bring a lot of work to our people. We have a lot of workplaces that will be established from these renewable sectors. And basically, if you have any understanding of economics or basically primary school math, what you can make from this is it will pay a lot of people, but it will be very cheap. That will mean it has to pay a lot of people a very shitty salary. That is the consequence of this. And if we put in the context of energy generated per human labor input, then we will find that wind and solar are one of the worst sources of energy that there can be. And contemporary modern fossil fuel extractions are one of the best in that matter. And nuclear and hydro and geothermal, they sit somewhere in the decent middle. So if you really want to believe this, and it's true. I mean, it has burned into my mind. This is my prime example. That back in the days when Trump was still a thing, and he talked about we need to bring our miners back to work. How many American liberals love to talk about, oh, there are just 80,000 coal miners in our country, but we have millions of people working in renewables. But still, the coal makes many, many more times more energy than the renewables, and you don't see the problem that is there. You don't see it. Because you are so stuck in this like 2008 financial crisis mindset of, oh, there are not enough workspaces around here, that we will create workplaces. So this is an achievement. No, when your energy policy is a jobs program, it will fail. It will utterly fail at being an energy policy, because energy policy is not to bring jobs to your people. Energy policy is to bring reliable, sustainable, and cheap energy to your people, which will then allow you to have other industries that can thrive off that cheap, reliable, and sustainable energy. And that requires you to have the least amount of labor going into that energy sector per unit of energy generated. And that is definitely not the case with wind and solar energy. And if all those renewables pundits, and especially politicians and media creators that have never spent a day in their life working in or concerning themselves with how heavy industry works, would know anything, they would know how saying, oh, renewables will create so many jobs, does not speak for renewables, it speaks against them. What you want to do is create a small amount of very high-paying jobs that provide a lot of energy, so that a lot of industry can then thrive off that.
Maybe following through with the German example that you're familiar with, like having lived through the Energiewende. I mean, in terms of this jobs creation program, clearly when you have an energy dilute source that requires a lot more steel, a lot more concrete, a lot more rare earth minerals, If you look at the job supply chain, I mean, there's a whole bunkwhack of jobs in China. A bunch of them are essentially forced or slave labor, in Xinjiang, for instance. But let's say there's a lot of jobs in China and Vietnam, rolling the metal towers for your wind turbines, et cetera. In Germany, you said there's some well-paying jobs in renewables. Is that more on the kind of finance side? Is that in the sort of maintenance of offshore wind turbines, which is pretty dangerous and high-skilled work? What does it look like? In Ontario, when we had our Green Energy Act, we were promised 50,000 green energy jobs because we were going to become a manufacturing hub for this wind and solar infrastructure. In the end, that didn't pan out. There was a World Trade Organization in ruling that said, no, that's protectionism. You can't actually mandate that the stuff is made in province or in country. And obviously, right now, we're seeing companies like GE and Vestas, and I think it's Gamesa, the three remaining big wind turbine manufacturers outside of China, are really in crisis and losing a lot of money right now. But back in the glory days of Energiewende, what did it look like as a jobs program in Germany? Is that part of why the Energiewende had an enduring level of support up until the energy crisis?
So the thing is that Germany recovered very rapidly from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So basically in the early 2010s, like creating jobs was not that important anymore. We have basically almost full employment for most of the 2010s. And certainly to an extent, a lot of that came from the renewables sector, which of course was plastered with incredible amounts of subsidies. So of course they could also pay a lot of people very well. However, a lot of that money did not just went into the pockets of tradesmen, it went into the pockets of consultants, of bankers, financiers, of lobbyists, and of lawyers. So that was a huge drain on all that money. And certainly then you have to pay all those tradesmen. However, one complication that we started running into in the late 2010s is that Germany is running out of craftsmen and tradesmen right now, and it is really hard to get them in Germany right now without having to pay a lot of it. Alternatively, you have to pay some less well-off people from Eastern Europe that might charge less money for their labor, but even those are very well aware right now that they can charge more for their money, for their work, than they used to be able of. So we are running into a scarcity of labor here, and this severely limits our ability to grow our renewables fleet. During our peak build-out time, we employed like 100,000 people in solar to construct 5 gigawatts of solar per year. So basically we are employing 20,000 people to install 1 gigawatt of solar. Keep in mind, 1 gigawatt of German solar creates 1 terawatt hour. That is not a lot much when we talk about country scale electricity production.
Yeah, Václav makes fun of that because it's like a 10% capacity factor, right?
A plant like Grunde would have employed around 3,000, a little bit less in the beginning, a little bit less in the end, construction workers for around 5 years. It would then last for around 8 years if it was ever fully utilized, and it would make 10 terawatt hours with a workforce of 300 people. So we are a good order of magnitude worse off than German nuclear was, although keep in mind German nuclear was most labor efficient of many nuclear sectors around the world. And in the wind sector, we have a similar figure. We have like 200,000 people working there, and we deployed similar amounts of installed capacity, but the wind has a little bit better, although a significantly better capacity factor than the solar has. So yes, we have a similar feat with wind that we employ around 40,000 people to install around a gigawatt of wind annually, and the amount of people actually that are working not in installing but in upkeep is also growing as we grow our fleet. So in the beginning, when we built a lot of wind and employed a lot of people in wind, those went into building a lot of wind. And now we are not building a lot of wind anymore, but we are still employing a lot of people in wind anymore. Still employing a lot of people in wind, And we're doing that because there is a lot of upkeep to the wind plant. Solar has less upkeep. But especially in solar, since we're talking about a lot of rooftop solar going online in Germany right now, which is also heavily subsidized, not just from like feed-in tariffs, but basically if you want to get a loan for your house in Germany right now, doing that without putting some solar on top of it is very hard, as there are state-sponsored financing programs like KfW, Kreditinstitut für Wiederaufbau, that will almost refuse any financing of a building if there is not some solar on the rooftop or some heat pumps or some zero energy living. So this is very hard, and this drives a lot of demand for rooftop solar, which drives a lot of demand for construction workers that are working in constructing roofs. So Dachdecker, people that build roofs, are one of the trades in Germany that we are the most low on right now. So all those roofing companies have a lot of orders, and they don't have enough people building those. And we see the cost of rooftop solar going through the roof. Right now, I've seen rooftop solar plants like 10 kilowatts, 25,000 euros. And if we adjust that for capacity factor, that is far more expensive than Vogtle.
It's interesting because, there's an all of the aboveism, which is very common within the sort of clean energy sector. And I push back against it because I think we should set clear goals and then analyze the available technologies based on their ability to meet those goals. And wind and solar have never historically met the goal of deep decarbonization of an electricity grid. They've, not been, to my mind, terribly consistent with just transition. They compete for, finite financial and material resources, but I hadn't really been as cognizant of the fact that they compete for human resources to a degree. We are within the West in general, within the developing world, dealing with a demographic collapse on the one hand, and also the fact that it's not been sexy for young people to go into the skilled trades when they could go into university or go into coding or computer fields and things like that. So that's an interesting secondary limitation that I think we need to be more aware of when we decide on making choices about which technologies to deploy. And I think those numbers you quoted on German nuclear versus wind and solar are very illustrative of that.
Yes, of course, but I don't want to be unreasonably hard on them, because German nuclear was a prime example how to get labor requirements right, how to use very few people, very skilled people to build a lot of nuclear and run a lot of nuclear. And German renewables are severely punished from a low capacity factor that German renewables gets. So, but even outside of Germany, where you have a lot of more sun, a lot more wind, and maybe your nuclear power plants are run less efficiently, you will still have this fact going on that you need like 3 to 4 times more people for wind and solar than you need for nuclear, and that doesn't even count in any batteries or backup power plants.
Right. No, I mean, certainly Canadian nuclear, I'd have to check the numbers, but it's definitely probably 700 to 1,000 people per gigawatt capacity at our CANDUs, because they just tend to be a little more labor intensive with online refueling and things like that. But skipping along,
still beats the renewables. But yes, you need a lot of people to run them.
I mean, there's also a lot. There's also a lot of jobs. Frankly, like it was interesting visiting Hunterston B, an advanced gas reactor in the UK, and there was just. Right. Anyway, there was a lot less, there were far fewer health physicists, for instance. The security going in was much more basic. I mean, they had armed security, but it was way lighter. You went through a metal detector. I don't think there was even any radiation screening on the way in or the way out. It was just a way more relaxed environment. I mean, we didn't go into anywhere where we'd have a real risk of contamination, but certainly at my Canadian nuclear plant visits, it's wild. I mean, you spend a third of the visit just going through radiation detectors. But all that aside, I mean, just to close this conversation on the German renewables, when I talked to the head of the COP26 German delegation in Glasgow, it was that interview with Stefan Halfe. That's available if you want to check the archives, my dear listeners. But one of the things I was sort of buttering him up on was, Germany was an early leader on renewables. They had developed quite a manufacturing sector around them. And he was very quick to say, yeah, but it's really all gone to China now. How long did it take for Germany to lose a lot of its, I think particularly solar manufacturing, and how much is left in terms of companies like Vestas or the wind turbine manufacturers? How quickly is that moving as those become less profitable? I've heard of big layoffs.
Yes, it's happening in the wind. Solar is almost already done now. So the solar leaving for China is something that happened in the early and mid 2010s. Um, that happened. Basically, we had a really huge demand increase in solar in the early 2010s, as the feed-in tariffs were still ridiculously high, but then they were a little bit lowered, and the Chinese were driving the German producers out of the market, because as those feed-in tariffs were lowered to a level that is still actually pretty high for electricity prices at the time, when renewables had feed-in tariffs of 6 to 10 cents per kilowatt hours, and electricity prices are at around 3 to 4. So it's still very much subsidized. But as those feed-in tariffs declined, German solar could not keep up with that, and Chinese solar could. And this was around the time when many of those solar makers in Germany died out, and Germany went from the leader in solar and PV productions to a country that has barely any photovoltaics production anymore.
And that's interesting because with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the growing but somewhat reluctant recognition of the forced labor conditions within Xinjiang, China, and probably more broadly throughout China, there's this talk of, well, we're just going to legislate and subsidize a solar industry back in the U.S. Or back in the West. Do you think that's something that's possible in Europe, in Germany, for instance, that solar can be brought back? I mean, is there enough? I guess the whole question is there enough subsidy? Is there enough financial capital that could be steered in that direction?
We should not delude ourselves that we will be in the future able to throw around those lavish amounts of money at problems anymore. Those times are passing, and as we are heading into even more severe shortages of labor, energy, and resources, this will be even more impossible. Those solar manufacturing jobs will not go back. Those solar manufacturing plants will not come back to Germany, because or if they will, only maybe in very small amounts, because we can't throw cash at them anymore like we did in the past, and we have a significantly reduced workforce. We have already a significantly reduced workforce to what we did in 2010, and by 2030 we will have lost 3 million full-time workers for our workforce from all the baby boomers, which disproportionately made up our population, retiring. And those people leaving, we can't really fill up, and this will make it impossible to really build up those manufacturing sectors anymore.
Not to mention the energy required. I mean, it was interesting having BF Randall on in our diesel powered decoupling episode. He was just talking about how we think of aluminum as being incredibly energy intensive, and I think in a previous episode you talked about a German aluminum manufacturer that uses something like 1.5% of all German electricity. But he was saying polysilicon is a whole other beast, or at least similar in terms of the energy demand required for its purification and manufacturing.
I know people that build the transformers for basically every wind and solar, all those solar polysilicon manufacturing companies. They modeled themselves after one specific German polysilicon producing company that was Wacker Burghausen, and this company used transformers for their polysilicon production from one specific company. So that one specific German company, because all the Chinese people were copying that company, all ordered the transformers from then one specific company in Germany, which then had to significantly expand its transformers production. So there goes a crap ton of electricity into manufacturing those solar panels. And B.F. Randall talked a lot about how diesel will be coming ever more scarce, and electricity will be coming ever more scarce. And this is what what will hinder our ambitions on deploying wind and solar, especially solar, is the shortage of electricity, additional to the shortage of diesel we will be facing over the next decade, possibly even next 2 decades.
Okay, so no, I've been meaning to chat with you about this guy I just discovered. Nate Hagens, I believe is his name. Podcast is The Great Simplification. I think he runs an institute called the Post Carbon Institute. And I've been listening to his podcast. He's a future guest. We're going to get him on as soon as possible because he has a really interesting background, I think, with an MBA background in economics, also an energy analyst and expert. And he talks a lot about energy return and energy invested. And just within the fossil fuel sector, how, used to be you could go to somewhere in Saudi Arabia or Texas and just stick a straw in the ground and the oil would come out. You'd get, EROEIs, like the amount of the barrel of oil in versus the barrel of out of 100 to 1 or even 500 to 1 in terms of some of the great gushers in Texas, for instance, and how we're having to use more and more energy, to get offshore oil or with fracking. And when you extend that example to renewable energy, the way that we're getting around that is often with, ultra low interest rates, trying to make capital as cheap as possible, subsidies, and that this is going to burn itself out. This sort of financial trickery and chicanery that's being employed to sort of make the party last a bit longer when it comes to fossil fuels, the depletion elements of oil fields, the difficulties getting the energy out. I mean, that's still a source of energy which has a high energy return, energy invested. But when you look at renewables and what we've been discussing and the subsidies that drove the German solar boom and disappeared and killed it, to me, this stands as a concept that's, I think, very, very important. In terms of the long-term economic viability of trying to live off the fumes of the energy that's created by these resources, the value given back versus what we're putting in. Does that ring true for you, or?
I found that made the party last a little bit longer. I find that funny because it's very much what is going on right now in Germany. It's okay. So I'm not those claims that basically the fossil fuels that we will be extracting in the future will have a significantly lower EROI than the ones that we were extracting in the past. Certainly true in the fact that it's based on the deposits of fossil fuels being harder to reach. I think it kind of ignores the technological progress that we are achieving in being able to extract them, in extracting resources that we were not being able to utilize in the past, like hydraulic fracturing, which certainly requires a lot of energy. I think Emmett Penny had once a guest that talked about how much, especially electrical energy, goes into, which then is derived from diesel, as he's pointed out, goes into running those hydraulic fracturing facilities. But I would not overstate it to the fact that the EROI of fossil fuels will very soon become so low that we can't sustain our civilization on them anymore. But that will happen to effect, and this is also one thing that I'm kind of worried about. In addition to that, is that as we are not being able to decarbonize with the tools that we are allowed to use to decarbonize, we will need to fall back on fossil fuels and need to keep burning fossil fuels, not just for the next 50 or the next 100, but maybe even for the next 200 years if we don't take another path. And if we do that, if we keep unleashing ever more amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we will also have to do increasing amounts of climate change adaptation. And this is certainly possible and certainly necessary. But one thing that I think is never really brought up in this discussion, where it's like, oh, we can just adapt and it's fine, 4 degrees of warming, nothing, and oh no, any amount of adaptation is heretical, and only prevention will be allowed, and the 1.5 degree goal has to be kept, and nothing else will make it. basically the harder you push it, the hotter the planet gets, the more adaptation you will have to make. And the more adaptation we will have to make, the more energy we will be burning on making that adaptation. And if we don't decarbonize our electricity supply, our energy supply, not just our total energy supply, that means that we will do that adaptation on fossil fuels while we need to still burn fossil fuels on running our societies. Keeping running on fossil fuels is like financing your livelihood on debt. And as you keep paying the bills with debt that you take, you have to pay an ever increasing amount on oh, for God's sakes, I forgot the word. Interest, of course, Zinsen, interest. You have to pay an ever increasing amount of interest while you still need to keep borrowing money. And this wind and solar is basically the delusion that you will soon take off as a musician and that will pay all the money that you have borrowed. And nuclear is getting your shit together and applying for a job and going to trade school and actually doing something with your life.
So I love talking to you, Noah. No, but that is, I think, I've attempted to develop that talking point, and you just did it in a much more sophisticated way. But in terms of communicating climate concern, because it's interesting. I think I've not shied away from having people that are climate complacent on the podcast because they're often brilliant engineers or brilliant analysts on energy more broadly. But in terms of communicating climate urgency, I think what you just said is so key. I've sort of in the past used this analogy of a boat that's sailing across the ocean, and as we add more carbon to the atmosphere, we're kind of throwing anchors overboard and impeding our progress forward. We're dragging these heavy anchors of adaptation, which will be required. And I want to see that boat sail freely and go and explore foreign lands and have a kick-ass time. It's not as strong of an analogy, I think, as you just used, but I don't want to restate what you've just made obvious. But I really do like that idea of interest. And that was a good riff off of kind of what I'd been talking about previously. Let's, in the time we have left, let's imagine that, the world comes to its senses, policymakers come to their senses. They recognize that we need to do a massive nuclear deployment. Maybe we can, I'm not sure how informed you are about countries like China that are actually doing a fairly aggressive deployment. But
and
we
being limited
about,
by their ability to train new nuclear technicians. That is their main limiting factor. They can deploy shitty coal power plants indefinitely in China, basically. They are not as limited as they are with nuclear power plants regarding the technicians it requires. I have recently talked to a technician working in a German lignite power plant, and I don't want to belittle that man. I learned a lot from him about German lignite. That plant he works in is certainly sophisticated, but many of the plants that we will be seeing going online in China and in India will not be as sophisticated and will not require a workforce trained to that degree to run them. And that is the main driver why they will be able to build those coal power plants and will not be able to build nuclear power plants in a large enough to extent that they can avoid building all those nuclear power all those coal power plants. If they want to build all those nuclear power plants in order to not just not expand coal but actually decline coal usage, we will need to train a crap ton of very skilled nuclear technicians.
It's interesting. I'm going to be interviewing His Excellency Mohammed Al Hamadi, the head of the Emirati Nuclear Energy Corporation, as well as the New World Association of Nuclear Operators president. Really honored to have him on. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. But we had a little premonition of that discussion with Seth Gray, who was talking about our COP27 experiences. But I think it's going to be interesting chatting with someone, who basically was the driving force directing a new nuclear program, and not a trivial one, right? 25% of the United Arab Emirates electricity will be coming from this Baraka nuclear power station, and they chose, I think, a model which wasn't for Korea to build, own, and operate, but very much to transfer rapidly. And it's some of the research I've done to prepare for that interview is just the degree to which they have developed those human factors. And obviously, this is a very rich country with a lot of foreign reserves. What do you think about the challenges of places like Poland and other countries that are maybe not as well resourced that are talking about doing really ambitious nuclear buildouts? We've seen a lot of countries over and over again say, like South Africa was going to do like 16 gigawatts at some point in collaboration with the Russians. In terms of the human factors limitation of that, I don't just want to be dissing renewables and in this kind of glowy-eyed optimism about nuclear. Like, I'm quite pessimistic about nuclear, unfortunately. I want to see it succeed. I think there's a lot of barriers to that. So I guess kind of in closing, let's just chat a little bit about what you see as those human factors limitations to expanding nuclear, especially for new countries, and ideas around how we can get around that or meet that challenge.
Here's the thing. Assume Germany closes all its nuclear power plants and Poland doesn't have any, and those two countries at the same time start planning for nuclear new builds. Who will be the first one to have nuclear new builds on the grid? Germany or Poland? Keep in mind, we have all closed all Gronde, Portdorf, Emsland, Aldron. But we start at the same time. Germany
and there's
and Poland
political
start
will.
at the same time building new plants. There's political will in both countries to an equal extent.
Okay.
Which country will be the first that
Well,
has
I would imagine Germany, given its experience and workforce.
Yes, there will always be. Even though we have decimated this nuclear workforce that we have, it will always be there to an extent, and we will be able to regrow out of there, especially once some foreign experience that comes to aid us. It's even from this position of a severely decimated nuclear workforce, it's easier to recover than from a standing start. And many nuclear startups that I don't hold in the highest regards see this standing start as an advantage, as they theorize that it could allow them to basically not worry about all the rules and regulations they would have to face in a country which has a nuclear sector. I doubt that will be the case. First reason will be many of those countries desperate for energy will definitely ask themselves, want they a tried and true technology that really helps them avoid the next energy crisis? Or will they be setting their sights on untested, untried, untrue new technology, which might promise to solve the current energy crisis sooner and cheaper, but might plunge them right into the next energy crisis, as that new technology run by an untrained staff will run into a lot of teething issues very soon and will have a lot of downtime in its first years, maybe even its first decades, maybe even its first 2 decades, as all nuclear reactors had. Even the good ones like CANDUs, LWRs, British gas reactors, and sodium fast reactors all had those teething issues. And I doubt that this will, and those were built in countries with much more lax regulations, similar to maybe a country that wants to start from a standstill. So this is what I am expecting. If any of those countries that doesn't have any nuclear sector whatsoever will go with those less trustworthy nuclear vendors and use their questionable technology and tries to do this on their unorthodox way, I fear this will lead to certainly some reactors going online very soon, maybe very cheaply, and then they will have a lot of teething problems that will ruin the reputation of the nuclear sector worldwide. This has happened in Germany with our line of very high temperature reactors, where we have 2 of them, both were shitty. They didn't wait long enough for enough data to return from the first one to design the second one, and the second one was terrible at a time when light water reactors were very well established and running very fine in the 80s. The gas-cooled reactor was terrible, was hilariously over budget. It was far more expensive than bituminous coal, which was far more expensive than lignite, which was far more expensive than light water reactor nuclear. It had shitty capacity factor. It broke on several occasions. It's supposedly unbreakable fuel elements due to overheating issues. When Chernobyl happened, it vented radioactivity in the surrounding area, tried to cover it up, and then failed at covering it up because, unlike Chernobyl, that reactor was fueled with fuel containing thorium. So the isotopes released by that venting were completely different from any isotopes released from Chernobyl. So they could be proven that they, because they were the only reactor around that had thorium in it, so it could be proven that it was them. And this reactor very much ruined the reputation of the German nuclear industry, because to many politicians and to many journalists and to many normal people, they couldn't not differentiate between this reactor and the standard line of light water reactors that the proper German nuclear industry was building at the time. To them, it was all the same. And so this reactor ruined the reputation of German nuclear. Among other things, also the smearing campaigns of the Greens and the coal lobby certainly played a role, but for that small endeavor, that failed gas-cooled reactor line in Germany, it did a lot of damage to nuclear reputation. And I certainly fear that failures in the nuclear sector grown from similar idiocy will hurt the industry and will significantly curtail our most important tool in our transitioning from fossil fuels to sustainable energy.
That's such an important cautionary tale, and I've definitely shared that perspective. And even with the technology as proven today as our light water and heavy water fleets, and the excellent capacity factors we're getting, it used to only be 50-60%. And the missing element in all that is not that the design changed, is that the humans running it got a lot better and their standards and practices and procedures improved. And that's the missing link. And the only time I find myself nodding along when I read some of the antis literature is when they say, for instance, with molten salt reactors at the Idaho National Labs, they had something like 200 unplanned outages in the 4 years of that reactor running. So when, these startup companies say this is a proven technology, it ran at, this national lab, they're not mentioning the dismal capacity factors achieved. And nuclear just has such a narrow tolerance for things not going perfectly, for it not being ultra economical, for it not being ultra reliable. It just seems like a lot of these, new vendors have to prove it first. Like they need to have I keep saying this and it's maybe naive. I mean, I'm an outsider. I don't really understand this stuff terribly well, but we have the ITER plant to look at the tokamak and really try and troubleshoot it, build it. Let's see how it runs, learn on it. It just seems that these technologies are premature. They need more time in development. You talked about how the submarine reactor fleet was so decisive in leading to us, having a pressurized water fleet, and not just because of the design, but because of the people's skill.
Keep in mind that the boiling water reactors that the U.S. Army championed were abandoned by the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army did never crank out a lot of technicians trained on boiling water reactors because they stopped trying to run their bases all around the world with boiling water reactors. It was abandoned as oil and coal did the trick. But not having a nuclear navy was not an option for the US. So they needed to have a nuclear navy, and that led to them cranking out PWR technicians.
That's fascinating. Well, I think that's a great way to bring this interview back to where it started. Noah, this was a fabulous conversation. I feel like we have to kind of hang up the phone because we're at an hour. But looking forward to a future episode. You're a huge nerd, and I mean that in the most endearing sense possible. You spend a lot of time in this area. For your youth, you have quite the encyclopedia stored in your cranium. And I'm looking forward to geeking out a little bit about your opinions on various reactor technologies and expanding upon this closing conversation that we've had. Because again, just so important that we don't squander a potential nuclear renaissance or nuclear renewal and are not hubristic in thinking, yeah, we can just try all this stuff, and if some of it fails, not a big deal. There's no tolerance for failure within nuclear. And in my mind, again, these novel designs need to prove themselves. They need to have their kinks worked out. They need to be developed, I think, as Russia's doing. But there's a lot of kinks. And talking with BF Randall, we're gonna have Cal Abel on soon, who's doing some really big picture thinking on using high temperature reactors and I believe coal pyrolysis, coal gasification as a tool to develop syn fuels and partially decarbonize. I mean, I think these are really important big picture topics for the future of nuclear. Closing the fuel cycle is important. If we do have 100 years of uranium reserves, that's vital for our long-term viability of the sector. But we have to really think carefully through how we do the next 10, 20, 30 years in order for that to be viable.
Do you know that Society of meme? And I think this is like the biggest Society of. It was in the 80s when the legit German nuclear industry, the one that was building boiling and pressurized water reactors, was looking in how to close a fuel cycle. They didn't look into sodium fast reactors. They looked into closing the fuel cycle with pressurized water reactors. And what they wanted to do is basically reducing the amount of water in the core of the pressurized water reactors. This would have led to the neutrons in the core, while still being thermal neutrons, being significantly faster than in usual pressurized water reactors. And in such a neutron spectrum, a reactor could run much more efficiently on plutonium fuel. So even though they couldn't really breed with such a reactor, they could get very close to that 1-to-1. For every one atom you split, you breed one. And even though they could not fully close it, establishing such a reactor would have allowed them to basically increase the amount of energy they could extract from a kilogram of mined uranium by a factor of 10 to 15. And that coupled especially with the French people who were at the time perfecting reprocessing and MOX production, where the French are still leading globally. No one does that as well as the French do. It's the one thing where they are not the leading light in nuclear, is reprocessing and MOX fuel production. And I think this German line of hard spectrum MOX high converter PWRs not being built is one of the biggest missed opportunities that we had in Germany, because this would have allowed us to not close, but get very close to closing the nuclear fuel cycle. It would have extended our supply of fissile material by an order of magnitude, and doing that without having to use any new reactor technology. As much as I like the sodium fast reactor, and as far as it is as far as it's already developed, far more than any salt or high temperature gas reactor, still is a lot of work to do to get the sodium fast reactor up to the level of pressurized water reactors. And being able to run your country on basically plutonium without a sodium fast reactor, without any fast reactor, with just a pressurized water reactor, this would have been enormous achievement. And I think we should try that again. I certainly, I have now looked at many reactors all around the world. I have not found anyone that I would love to see as much blooming as basically those old lines of German pressurized water reactors. They were perfect. They were expensive plants, but not as expensive as actually cheap. Not as cheap as the French built them. They were significantly more expensive than that. But they were built to last, and they could last for an eternity. with very low maintenance going on, with very high capacity factors, they could be turned into almost breeder reactors. And I think this is something where I would like to see us going back again, also trying those MOX fuel high converters, and generally putting a lot of more of our eggs into the pressurized water reactor basket, be they light water reactors or be they CANDUs. I think this is a reactor that is severely underestimated, not just for electricity production, but also for hydrogen and for process heat.
Interesting. Okay. Well, there you have it, folks. A teaser of our upcoming show where we are going to geek out hard on different reactor technologies. We're going to, what is the term again? Something about take no prisoners. It's straight talk. That's what I enjoy about chatting with you, Noah. You're a free agent. You don't have a party line to toe. And it's always fascinating chatting with you. So thank you for coming back on Decouple.
It always feels like I made a lot of frenemies among my own kind.
You always say that you've gained like 100 followers and lost 20 or something. It's on Twitter. It's always interesting with you. But I think that's again what makes you an entertaining guest here. So the people will decide, whether you get back in the top 5 here. But I enjoyed this conversation immensely. Thanks again for coming on, Noah.
I'm surprised every time that I'm apparently so highly valued by your listeners. Keep in mind, I'm a 22 lab technician in training that makes his money by machining laser parts.
That sounds pretty fucking cool to me. Okay, Noah, we'll talk soon.